Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Lagana. I'm an independent education consultant. I started my career as a classroom teacher and have been a district administrator, school evaluator, and now support schools, districts, and nonprofits across the country on a range of educational issues. I have prepared this analysis on behalf of Root Ed Denver, and I'm excited to share it with you today. Today, we will look at how academic performance is measured in Colorado, do a look at how Denver Public Schools performed in 2022, and then talk a little bit about why the data matters and how we can use it. Our objectives for today are to demonstrate why educators, families, elected leaders, and community partners should pay careful attention to academic performance. We also want to build a basic understanding of how academic performance is measured in Colorado. We will then turn to providing an overview of Denver Public Schools' academic performance in 2022. We will pay particular focus to how some student subgroups performed. Finally, we will offer suggestions on how this data could be used to support students moving forward. So we will start with how academic performance is measured in Colorado, because we know it can be complicated, and why it's important. We all know that schools serve many purposes in our communities and provide a range of supports to their students. They are community hubs and safe spaces for our students. We also know that preparing all students for life after school, be it college or career, remains a core goal of our public schools. Looking at students' abilities to read and do math at grade level is one indicator of how schools are progressing towards this goal, and that is academic performance. We also know that our education system has not served all students equitably, historically or currently, and that this has contributed to inequitable outcomes in our society. It is critical that we look at academic progress for these historically underserved groups to better understand these gaps and to work to address them. We also know that academic performance data is most valuable when it is comprehensive and shows how all students in our system are doing, which means that the majority of students have participated in the assessments underlying this data. By stressing the importance of academic performance, we are not saying that other outcomes and components of schools don't matter. We know student mental health, teacher satisfaction, extracurriculars, all of these are critical, but so is academic performance, and that is where we will spend our time today. We now want to spend some time unpacking how Colorado measures academic performance. At the highest level is the Colorado District and School Performance Framework, which are annual ratings issued by the Colorado Department of Education for all districts and schools across the state. This framework is used as an indicator of school quality and is a key component of how the state holds districts and schools accountable. These ratings are created based on a roll-up of a range of academic indicators that include academic achievement, academic growth, and for our high schools, post-secondary readiness. Schools and districts each receive a rating that you can see on this slide, with the highest for schools being performance and districts being able to get an accredited with distinction rating. Later on, we'll look a little bit at how schools across Denver Public Schools did on this indicator. There's a range of academic assessments that are used in Colorado. A few of them are listed here. The first is the READ Act assessment, which measures how well our youngest learners are learning to read in grades K to 3. This assessment is used primarily to identify students in need of extra help or intervention. It is not on the district or school performance framework, so we will not spend time on it today, but important to know that this does exist. Once our students reach 3rd grade, they start to take the Colorado Measures of Academic Success, or CMAS, annually in both English language arts and math, from grades 3 through the end of middle school in grade 8. When students transition to high school, they then take the PSAT or the SAT annually in both literacy and math. Colorado does also assess in science and social studies at select grades, but that is not our focus today. There is also the Access Assessment, which is given to all English language learners to measure their language proficiency. Across assessments, we can look at results in 3 main ways. The first is academic achievement. Are students meeting grade level standards on a particular assessment. So what percent of kids in third grade are doing math at a third grade level, for example. We can also look at academic growth, which is the amount of growth students make year over year compared to their peers. This is really important because we know not all students come in at the same starting place, and academic growth is in some ways one of the better indicators of the impact a school is making on an individual student. Finally, it is important to look at subgroup performance, which is disaggregated performance based on student demographics. For example, based on race and ethnicity or free and reduced lunch eligibility. In doing this, we can look at how these groups do in a particular school or district compared to statewide. So for example, how do Black students in DPS perform compared to Black students across the state of Colorado? We can also look at gaps within an individual district or school. So for example, how do Black students in DPS perform compared to white students in DPS? In this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about both of those. We want to further unpack academic growth a little bit, given its importance and the complexity of how it's reported. In Colorado, we report the growth of an entity, be it a school or a district, as a median growth percentile, or MGP. The MGP is calculated by taking the median of individual student growth percentiles for all the students within that school or district. Individual student growth percentiles are calculated by looking at how much growth a student makes on state assessments compared to their prior performance. We then compare this growth to the growth made by other students who performed similarly in prior years. We'll walk through an example. If we look at 100 students from across Colorado who scored the same on third grade CMAS math in 2021, we would look at their performance in 2022 and rank order them. The student with the highest 2022 score would have a student growth percentile of 99. The student who had a score lower than all but 5 of the same 100 student cohort would have a student growth percentile of 5. We would then take the median of these students and all the other students in a particular school or district to get the school's median growth percentile. We do want to make a couple of notes as well about this. First of all, is students are grouped based solely on prior performance, not their demographics, their geography, or any other factors. It's also important to note that a student can have a very different score on the assessment and similar student growth percentiles if the students they're being compared to also perform very differently. Based on all of this, it's important to also note that an MGP of 50, sort of that middle between 0 to 100, is an indicator that students are growing on pace with their peers statewide. So an MGP above 50 means students are progressing more quickly than they might be expected to be. An MGP below 50 means they are progressing more slowly. Now that we've looked a little bit about how we calculate academic performance, we're going to transition to looking at the 2022 performance in Denver Public Schools, including disaggregated analysis of performance over time, some bright spots, and then also performance across school type. Quick summary, and then we'll dive into the details. Performance did decline in DPS from 2019 to 2022, which was also true statewide and across the country in the post-COVID world. However, DPS did see larger declines in the state overall. That said, there were also areas where DPS saw greater growth in the state on CMAS assessments. Similar to national trends, different groups within DPS were differently impacted by the pandemic. Black and Hispanic students saw much larger declines than their white counterparts, while FRL students actually saw smaller declines than their non-FRL eligible peers. That said, there are still large persistent achievement gaps across subgroups in DPS, and most subgroups in DPS are outperformed by their peers statewide. One area where this is not true is for white students and non-FRL eligible students who outperform their peers statewide. We'll now dive into sort of the detailed data behind these. So Denver, like most of Colorado and the country, did see declines in performance after the COVID-19 pandemic. Performance did rebound slightly from 2021, but it is important to note the 2021 performance is only indicative of particular grades, and many students chose not to participate in assessments. DPS saw larger declines than the state overall, which widened the gap between DPS and their state colleagues. On SAT, While DPS also saw declines, these declines were on par with the state, and over time, their declines have largely mirrored the state. Both DPS and the state saw their lowest scores in over 5 years in 2022. As we said, not all students in Denver were impacted in learning loss in the same way. Students of color saw larger declines in performance on CMAS than white students. American Indian and Hispanic students in particular saw large declines, and white students continue to far outperform any other group in performance. For example, on CMAS ELA, our top graph, 33.9% of American Indian students were proficient in 2019, compared to only 16.1% in 2022, a decline of over 17 percentage points, while white students only saw a decline of 1.6 percentage points. Continuing with subgroup performance, both FRL eligible and non-FRL eligible students saw performance decline between 2019 and 2022. Non-FRL eligible students did see a larger decrease in performance, but there still continues to be a wide gap in performance between FRL eligible students and their non-FRL eligible peers. So while we have seen the performance declined in many areas, there were areas where Denver students showed higher growth than their statewide peers. Again, an MGP of 50 indicates progress is similar to peers across the state. So on CMAS in both subjects, DPS students made more progress than their peers statewide, despite declining proficiency rates. On PSAT and SAT, DPS students overall saw lower growth than peers statewide. Some groups in Denver do outperform their peers statewide, which includes white students and non-FRL eligible students. This could indicate a range of factors, including strong performance at schools that serve a high percentage of these students. English language learners in Denver also outperform their peers statewide. However, these students did see substantive declines from 2019 to 2022, which were greater than their peers. Additionally, on the access assessment, which measures language proficiency, DPS ELL students saw slightly lower growth than the state, with an MGP of 49. Again, slightly below that 50 MGP threshold of comparable progress. Looking more broadly at academic achievement is high school graduation rates, which continue to be a relative bright spot for students in Denver, as well as other districts across the state. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, both DPS and the state saw only small decreases in graduation rates for the class of 2021. While DPS graduation rates are still below the state, this gap has closed considerably since 2017, as DPS graduation rates have increased and the state rate has stayed relatively consistent. While there are these bright spots, it's important to note that most student subgroups in Denver show demonstrable opportunity gaps. In many cases, these gaps have also widened since 2019. The largest gaps in DPS are based on race and ethnicity. These racial gaps in DPS are larger than the state, while some others are smaller. For example, Black students in DPS have a proficiency rate that is 46.2 points lower than for white students in DPS. In addition to sort of these academic gaps within Denver, we also want to look at how student subgroups in Denver are performing compared to their peer groups statewide. In looking at this, we see that subgroups representing some of the most at-risk students in DPS are outperformed by their peers statewide. And in many cases, these gaps have grown since 2019. So one example here that we can look at is on CMAS Math. Our DPS sees 13.6 of free and reduced lunch eligible students proficient compared to 14% across the state. While not a large gap, it is still an important gap to take note of. On the SAT, where we look at mean scale score instead of proficiency rate because of how this data is reported by the state, we see that special education students in DPS have an average score of 775 compared to an average score of 800 for special education students with an IEP across the state. Transitioning from student group to governance type, we see that there are both bright spots and struggles in schools across all governance types in Denver. In Denver, we think about our schools as having 4 governance types. There are traditional district managed schools. There are district managed innovation schools, which have some level of flexibility from key policies and statutes. There are innovation zone schools, which have the flexibilities of innovation schools, but also are supported by an independent nonprofit organization. We then have our public charter schools, which operate with a nonprofit board that oversees them in contract with the Board of Education. Here we can see that innovation schools consistently outperform other governance types. District managed schools consistently the second highest performing governance type. That said, these types of schools have very different demographics, which is important to keep in mind when looking at this data. For example, charter schools serve a much higher percent of FRL eligible students than other governance types in the district overall. We'll dive a little bit more into this now. On the state SPF, which we talked about earlier, Denver charter schools outperform among all student types, but particularly outperform district schools with high poverty student populations. So when we look at all schools, 74% of charter school students are in schools with a performance rating, which, as a reminder, is the highest rating available, compared to only 62% of students in district-run schools. This gap gets even wider when we look only at schools that have 75% or more of students eligible for free and reduced lunch. In these schools, 68% of charter school students are in schools with a performance rating, compared to only 25% in district schools. Said differently, high poverty charter schools actually outperform district schools of all demographics. Additionally, charter schools still better serve FRL eligible students, despite serving higher proportions of them. As Denver has evolved over time, demographics have also shifted within Denver public schools. Since 2016, the percent of FRL eligible students in the district overall has declined 8 percentage points. However, in charter schools, this has only been a 3 percentage point decline, and charters now serve a significantly higher percentage of FRL eligible students, 69% compared to 60% in the district overall. Despite this, charter schools still get higher outcomes for FRL eligible students than non-charters, and also see a smaller gap between their FRL eligible and non-FRL eligible students. As we can see in ELA, CMAS ELA, almost 26% of charter FRL students are proficient compared to only 19.4% in our non-charter schools. Charter schools also see growth that is relatively similar to non-charter schools, despite some declines in proficiency rates. In ELA, for example, 51.6% of charters had an MGP of 50 or higher, compared to 57.6% of non-charters. This gap is even smaller in math at only 0.2%. Now that we've dove into the data and these results, we want to talk a little bit about how stakeholders could use this data and other academic results to improve outcomes for all students. First of all, while there's not a clear trend in governance type or model that leads to successful outcomes for all students, it is important that we learn from the bright spots that we know exist across school types in Denver and commit to using these best practices to improve outcomes for our Black and Brown students. Secondly, we know that there are many conversations happening in Denver now around enrollment declines as the number of school-age children in the metro area declines. It's important that we ensure all students have access to high-quality education experiences and that we're considering academics and other measures of school quality in conjunction with enrollment. Additionally, as DPS also embarks on its new strategic plan, it is critical that we learn from these results, make sure that best practices are embedded in our work, and seek to deliver a high-quality education for all Denver students. Finally, we know that these results tell a very important story, but are not the whole story. We must work as a community to define and transparently share other measures of school quality to help all stakeholders understand our schools and make informed choices for their students and communities. Thank you.